This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Landon D.C. Elkind at the University of Iowa in Coralville, Iowa. Pragmatism, footnote 1, reprinted from the Edinburgh Review, April 1909, end of footnote 1. The appearance in the world of a genuinely new philosophy is at all times an event of very great importance. More particularly is this the case when the new philosophy embodies the prevailing temper of the age better than any of its older rivals. For in that case it is likely to establish itself in popular favor, to color the thoughts of the educated and half-educated public, and to strengthen those elements in the mental atmosphere to which it owes its success. It would be a mistake to suppose that new philosophies are always adapted to the age in which they appear, but when they are not, they fail to win wide acceptance, whatever their other merits may be. Spinoza, for example, deserved success as well as Leibniz, yet his works were almost wholly neglected until more than a century after his death, because the political and intellectual milieu was not one in which they could thrive. Leibniz, on the contrary, gave scope to the love of calculation which men derived from the discoveries of his time, and represented the world as a hierarchy of systems, each exactly like the Holy Roman Empire. His system, therefore, ruled the German mind until the ferment which preceded the French Revolution set men's thoughts running in new channels. The philosophy which is called pragmatism or humanism, footnote 1, these two names are distinguished by William James and Dr. Schiller in various ways at various times. For our purposes, it is unnecessary to consider these distinctions. End of footnote 1. Is genuinely new, and is singularly well adapted to the predominant intellectual temper of our time. As regards its adaptation to the age, we shall have more to say when we have considered what it is. As regards novelty, its authors show a modesty which, in our opinion, is somewhat excessive. Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking, William James calls his book, and Dr. Schiller constantly asserts that his doctrines are those of Protagoras. As for Protagoras, we know sufficiently little about him to be able to read into him almost any doctrine we please, and the appeal to him may be regarded as mainly due to the desire to produce an ancestry which has acquired respectability by the lapse of time. With regard to more modern precursors, it must be admitted that many philosophers, as chief among whom we may mention Nietzsche, have paved the way for the new doctrines. Nevertheless, the cardinal point in the pragmatist philosophy, namely its theory of truth, is so new and so necessary to the rest of the philosophy, even to those parts which had been previously maintained by others, that its inventors cannot be regarded as merely developing the thoughts of less explicit predecessors. The name pragmatism was first invented by Mr. C.S. Peirce as long ago as 1878. It was applied by him to the doctrine that the significance of a thought lies in the actions to which it leads. In order to estimate the difference between two different beliefs about the same matter, he maintained, we ought to consider what difference in conduct would result, according as we adopted the one belief or the other. If no difference would result, the two beliefs are not effectively different. Mr. Peirce's doctrine, however, remained sterile until it was taken up 20 years later by William James, who, while retaining the word pragmatism, gave it a more sweeping significance. The full-fledged philosophy is to be attributed to him and Dr. Schiller jointly. Professor Dewey of Columbia University is also to be reckoned among the founders of pragmatism. His writings are more technical and less popular than those of James and Dr. Schiller, but on certain points, his exposition is perhaps preferable to theirs. Footnote 1. Confer especially an article on The Experimental Theory of Knowledge, Mind, New Series, number 59, July 1906. End of footnote 1. As an introduction to pragmatism, it is interesting to read William James's essay on the will to believe, first published in 1896 and reprinted in book form in the following year. In this essay, though the word pragmatism does not appear, we find much that is characteristic of James's later views. The thesis he is advocating is that, in certain cases, it is right to believe wholeheartedly in one of two alternatives, even when there is no evidence as to which of them is true. These cases arise, he says, when we are compelled to choose between two hypotheses, each of which seems to us possible, and when it makes a great difference which we choose. The instances he has in mind are chiefly questions of morals and religion. In a moral perplexity, we are compelled to come to some decision, since inaction is as much a decision as action. In regard to religion also, we must act as though it were true or as though it were false. We are therefore practically compelled to choose. His contention is that, in such cases, it would be foolish to refuse to have faith merely on the ground that we do not find conclusive evidence on either side of the question. To quote his own words, quote, "Our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must, decide an option between propositions, whenever it is a genuine option that cannot by its nature be decided on intellectual grounds. For to say, under such circumstances, do not decide but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision, just like deciding yes or no, and is attended with the same risk of losing the truth." End of quote. He proceeds to justify himself against the charge of insufficient regard for truth, not, as he would now, by contending that in the absence of other evidence, the answer which gives the greatest emotional satisfaction is true, but on a variety of grounds tending to show that there are no sufficient moral arguments against thinking it true. He points out, to begin with, that emotions and wishes, though often unable to alter our beliefs when these have become established, nevertheless play a great part in initially deciding what our beliefs are to be. He points out next that our duty in the matter of opinion has two branches. 1. We must know the truth. 2. We must avoid error. These two precepts, he says, have very different results. If in cases where evidence is lacking, we abstain wholly from either belief, we are sure of not incurring error, but on the other hand, we are sure of not knowing truth. If, however, we decide for one of the alternatives, we have an even chance of knowing the truth. It follows that those who urge us to abstain from belief, in the absence of evidence, consider it more important to avoid error than to believe truth. This horror of being duped he represents as a somewhat contemptible form of cowardice. Quote, "Our errors," he says, "are surely not such awfully solemn things. In a world where we are so certain to incur them, in spite of all our caution, a certain lightness of heart seems healthier than this excessive nervousness on their behalf." End of quote. The legitimate conclusion from this argument would be that, in such cases as William James has in mind, we ought to believe both alternatives, for in that case we are sure of knowing the truth in the matter. If it were said that to believe both is a psychological impossibility, We would rejoin that, on the contrary, it is often done, and that those who cannot yet do it need only practice the will to believe until they have learnt to believe that the law of contradiction is false, a feat which is by no means as difficult as it is often supposed to be. William James proceeds to point out that, in the case of religion, the choice between believing and disbelieving possesses all the characteristics of the options which, according to him, ought to be decided by the emotions. He tacitly assumes that there is no evidence for or against religion, and he points out that by refusing either to believe or to disbelieve, we lose the benefits of religion just as much as by deciding to disbelieve. Quote, "Skepticism, then, is not avoidance of option. It is option of a certain particular kind of risk. Better risk loss of truth than chance of error. That is your faith vetoer's exact opinion. He is actively playing his stake as much as the believer is. He is backing the field against the religious hypothesis, just as the believer is backing the religious hypothesis against the field. It is not intellect against all passions, then. It is only intellect with one passion laying down its law. And by what, forsooth, is the supreme wisdom of this passion warranted? Dupery for dupery. What proof is there that dupery through hope is so much worse than dupery through fear?" End of quote. The conclusion is that, although there is no evidence in favor of religion, we ought nevertheless to believe it, if we find satisfaction in so doing. This essay on the will to believe is important, because it has been widely read and much criticized, both adversely and favorably, and because it affords a good introduction to the pragmatist temper of mind. Some practice in the will to believe is an almost indispensable preliminary to the acceptance of pragmatism, and conversely, pragmatism, when once accepted, is found to give full justification of the will to believe. We shall therefore, before proceeding to pragmatism proper, consider briefly what there is to be said on a common sense basis against the doctrines so persuasively set forth in this essay. We may observe, to begin with, the agnostic hypothesis upon which the whole argument rests. The hypothesis is that no evidence for or against religion is at present known. Pragmatists pose as the friends of religion, except in Italy, and many religious people have accepted them as allies. It is therefore worthwhile to emphasize this underlying hypothesis and to point out the very questionable wisdom of accepting it as the basis of a defense of orthodoxy. With the truth or falsehood of this hypothesis, however, we need not concern ourselves in this discussion. The question for us is whether, granting the hypothesis, we can accept the results which William James derives from it. Let us observe, in the first place, a confusion which runs through the whole pragmatist account of knowledge, namely the confusion between acting on an hypothesis and believing it. In the cases which William James has in mind, the option between rival hypotheses is, he says, a forced option. That is, it is not avoidable. Quote, "If I say either accept this truth or go without it, I put on you a forced option, for there is no standing place outside of the alternative." End of quote. This statement appears to us to be contrary to many of the plainest facts of daily life. If, in walking along a country road, I come to a fork where there is no signpost and no passer-by, I have, from the point of view of action, a forced option. I must take one road or other if I am to have any chance of reaching my destination, and I may have no evidence whatever as to which is the right road. I then act on one or another of the two possible hypotheses, until I find someone of whom I can ask the way. but I do not believe either hypothesis. My action is either right or wrong, but my belief is neither, since I do not entertain either of the two possible beliefs. The pragmatist assumption that I believe the road I have chosen to be the right one is erroneous. To infer belief from action, in the crude way involved in the assumption that we must either accept this truth or go without it, is to ignore the plain fact that our actions are constantly based upon probabilities and that, in all such cases, we neither accept a truth nor go without it, but entertain it as a hypothesis. This applies in particular to the working hypotheses of science. A man of science who considers it worthwhile to devise experimental tests of an hypothesis and to construct elaborate theories which use the hypothesis is not on that account to be regarded as believing the hypothesis. Pragmatists tell us that, in such cases, the initial unverified belief is a necessary condition for the subsequent established theory, and by so doing they make out a case for the usefulness of believing before we have evidence. This is, however, a mistaken analysis of the state of mind of a man who is testing an hypothesis. All that is required, and all that occurs among careful investigators, is the belief that the hypothesis has a greater or smaller chance of being true, and for this belief that there is probably sufficient evidence. The actual belief that the hypothesis is true, when it occurs, is apt to be a hindrance, since it retards the abandonment of false hypotheses when the evidence goes against them, and if the belief is general, it makes people regard experimental verification as unnecessary. The Aristotelians who opposed Galileo and refused to give weight to his experiments had faithfully obeyed the precepts revived by William James. The matter is, however, more complicated in such cases as religious beliefs, where the chief benefit is derived from the emotional satisfaction of the belief itself, not from the useful actions to which it directly prompts. But here too, the antithesis of accepting or going without is far too crude. We may regard the belief as more or less probable, entertain a greater or less degree of hope that it may be true, and derive, accordingly, a greater or less proportion of the comfort we should derive from complete belief. In practice, to adopt the pragmatist's test, the effect of partial belief is very different from that of complete belief. Complete belief, if the issue is sufficiently momentous, will justify persecution, assuming, as history warrants us in doing, that the blood of Protestant martyrs is the seed of the Catholic Church. An incomplete belief, on the contrary, will not warrant the infliction of an indubitable evil for the sake of a gain which may possibly be illusory. This affords a pragmatic argument against conceding full belief in such cases as those with which William James is concerned. But if, as he assumes, there is a genuine possibility of the truth of an hypothesis, it is in accordance with all the strictest tenets of scientific veracity that we should bear the hypothesis in mind and allow to it whatever influence over our emotions and actions corresponds to the degree of its probability. We will next examine the argument that, in doubtful cases, the precept, "we must know the truth," should lead us to believe one hypothesis at a venture, since if we believe neither, we certainly do not know the truth. This argument rests upon an ambiguity in the word "know." At first sight, it might be thought that if we believe what is in fact true, we must have knowledge. But this is not the sense in which the word is commonly used. Suppose, to take a trivial instance, that a man believed that the late Prime Minister's name began with a B, but believed this because he thought Mr. Balfour was the late Prime Minister. What he believes is in fact true, yet no one would say that he knew that the late Prime Minister's name began with a B. In this case, The true belief is based upon a false reason. But the case is similar when the true belief is based upon no reason, except indeed in the case of immediate data, such as the facts of perception. Thus, if, in the case of an option which we have no rational means of deciding, we believe one alternative at a venture, we cannot be said to know, even if, by good luck, we have chosen the alternative which in fact is true. In such cases we cannot know the truth, though we may by chance believe it. Hence the precept, "We must know the truth," which James invokes, is irrelevant to the issue. The usual antitheses of belief and disbelief, what is known and what is unknown, are not adequate to meet the situation. The true precept of veracity, which includes both the pursuit of truth and the avoidance of error, is this: we ought to give every proposition which we consider, as nearly as possible, that degree of credence which is warranted by the probability it acquires from the evidence known to us. The further questions what propositions to consider and how much trouble to take to acquire knowledge of the evidence depend, of course, upon our circumstances and the importance of the issue. But to go about the world believing everything, in the hope that thereby we shall believe as much truth as possible, is like practicing polygamy in the hope that among so many we shall find some one who will make us happy. Another interesting point to observe in James's doctrine is the immense multiplicity of differing beliefs which it simultaneously justifies in different people. This arises from the condition that the option must be what he calls a living option. That is, it must be one in which either alternative seems to us possible. Quote, "If I say to you, be a theosophist or be a Mohammedan, it is probably a dead option, because for you neither hypothesis is likely to be alive. But if I say, be an agnostic or be a Christian, it is otherwise. Trained as you are, each hypothesis makes some appeal, however small, to your belief." End of quote. He points out that to different people, different options are living. It follows that the beliefs which, on his principles, different men ought to adopt are different, since the three conditions for adopting a belief without evidence are that the option should be living, forced, and momentous. One gathers, perhaps wrongly, from his instances that a Frenchman ought to believe in Catholicism, an American in the Monroe Doctrine, and an Arab in the Mahdi. He wrote before the Battle of Omdurman. It seems odd that, in view of this outcome, he should maintain that acceptance of his doctrine would diminish persecution. For an essential part of each of the above three creeds is that people who think otherwise must be taught their place. To sum up our criticism of the will to believe, it ignores the distinction between believing and entertaining a hypothesis, and wrongly assumes that if we do not completely believe a hypothesis, we must either completely disbelieve it or wholly suspend judgment. Hence, it is able to represent the option, either accept this truth or go without it, as one from which there is no escape, whereas all experiment, both in science and in daily life, implies a state of mind which accepts neither alternative. He assumes that we may be said to know a truth when we believe it at a venture, without reasons, and that, therefore, in order to maximize our knowledge, we have only to maximize our beliefs. And his doctrines lead to the conclusion that different people ought to have incompatible beliefs. These objections, we shall find, may also be urged against full-fledged pragmatism. But we must now approach somewhat more difficult topics than those which have concerned us hitherto, since pragmatism cannot be understood without examining its doctrine as to the nature of truth. To this doctrine, therefore, we will now turn our attention. The pragmatic theory of truth takes credit to itself, rightly as we think, for due consideration of error. Most theories as to the nature of truth have tacitly assumed to begin with that all our beliefs are true, and have arrived at results incompatible with the existence of error. They have then had to add a postscript explaining that what we call error is really partial truth. If we think it is Tuesday when it is really Wednesday, we are at least right in thinking that it is a day of the week. If we think America was discovered in 1066, we are at least right in thinking that something happened in that year. If we think Charles I died in his bed, we are at least so far right that, in view of the many people who do die in their beds, he probably had the potentiality of dying in his bed, and so on. Dr. Schiller rightly points to the Theaetetus as showing the difficulties to which a theory of knowledge is reduced by neglecting to take due account of error from the beginning. And among more recent books, Mr. Joachim's The Nature of Truth is used to point the same moral. Pragmatism, then, emphasizes from the start the fact that some of our beliefs turn out to be mistaken, and that the proper business of a theory of truth is to show how truth and falsehood are distinguished. This might seem, to those not sophisticated by philosophy, to be an obvious truism, but in fact philosophy has always regarded it as its business to prove, as far as possible, that everything is true, rather than to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Similarly, in ethics, philosophers have not sought to distinguish between the good and the bad, so much as to prove that everything is good. If little truth has been attained in philosophy, the reason is chiefly that few philosophers have wished to attain truth. Whether pragmatists are superior in this respect, we shall not venture to pronounce. But at any rate, the peculiarity of their bias makes them willing to admit facts which other philosophers find inconvenient, and among such facts is the prevalence of error. In order to discover the difference between truth and falsehood, pragmatism sets about a Socratic inductive inquiry as to the things we call true and false. These words, to begin with, are applied to beliefs, and are applied only when a question has arisen. Concerning the ordinary facts of perception, we do not ask questions until we have become philosophers. We do not apply either of the words true and false to such unquestioned matters. But when once the question has arisen concerning some actual belief, is it a true or false belief? How do we in fact decide the question? The answer of pragmatism is that if the belief furthers the purpose which led us to ask the question, it is regarded as true belief. If it fails to further the purpose, it is regarded as a false belief. This, therefore, according to pragmatism, is the meaning of the words true and false. True means furthering the purpose which led to the question. Or, more explicitly, when in pursuing any purpose, a belief is entertained which is relevant to the purpose, the belief is true if it furthers the achievement of the purpose, and false if it does not do so. Footnote 1. Confer Schiller, Studies in Humanism, page 154. End of footnote 1. A few quotations will serve to amplify and elucidate the above brief statement. After explaining recent changes in the methodology of science, James says, quote, "Riding now on the front of this wave of scientific logic, Messrs. Schiller and Dewey appear with their pragmatist account of what truth everywhere signifies. Everywhere, these teachers say, truth in our ideas and beliefs, means the same thing that it means in science. It means, they say, nothing but this, that ideas, which themselves are but parts of our experience, become true just insofar as they help us to get into satisfactory relations with other parts of our experience. End of quote. Footnote 2. Pragmatism, pages 57-58. End of footnote 2. Again, quote, I am well aware how odd it must seem to some of you to hear me say that an idea is true so long as to believe it is profitable to our lives. That is good for as much as it profits, you will gladly admit. But is it not a strange misuse of the word truth, you will say, to call ideas also true for this reason? You touch here upon the very central point of Messrs. Schiller's, Dewey's, and my own doctrine of truth. Let me now say only this, that truth is one species of good, and not, as is usually supposed, a category distinct from good, and coordinate with it. The true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief, and good too for definite assignable reasons. End of quote. Footnote 3. Pragmatism, pages 75-76. End of footnote 3. The sixth of William James's lectures on pragmatism is concerned wholly with the notion of truth. He begins by assenting to the dictionary definition that truth means the agreement of our ideas with reality. But, as he justly discovers, this definition does not take us very far, unless we know what we mean by agreement and what we mean by reality. The pragmatist holds that different sorts of agreement and different sorts of reality are concerned in different cases. The popular notion that a true idea must copy its reality holds good, he says, of sensible things, but goes wrong as soon as we come to abstractions. The idea of the elasticity of a spring, for example, cannot, according to him, be a copy of reality, presumably on the ground that an elasticity is not an actually existing thing. The question is, then, what sort of agreement with reality is possible in such cases? Quote, the great assumption of the intellectualists, he says, is that truth means essentially an inert, static relation. End of quote. An intellectualist, by the way, is anyone who is not a pragmatist. He proceeds, quote, Pragmatism, on the other hand, asks its usual question. Grant an idea or belief to be true, it says. What concrete difference will its being true make in anyone's actual life? How will the truth be realized? What experiences will be different from those which would obtain if the belief were false? What, in short, is the truth's cash value in experiential terms? The moment pragmatism asks this question, it sees the answer. True ideas are those that we can assimilate, validate, corroborate, and verify. False ideas are those that we cannot. The truth of an idea is not a stagnant property inherent in it. Truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. Its verity is, in fact, an event, a process. The process, namely, of its verifying itself, its verification. Its validity is the process of its validation. End of quote. Footnote 1. See the same source, pages 200-201. End of footnote 1. Recurring to the definition of truth as agreement with reality, James sums up by distinguishing three kinds of reality. 1. Concrete facts. 2. Quote, abstract kinds of things and relations perceived intuitively between them, end of quote. 3. Truths already in our possession. Agreement he defines as follows, quote, to agree in the widest sense with a reality can only mean to be guided either straight up to it or into its surroundings, or to be put into such working touch with it as to handle either it or something connected with it better than if we disagreed. End of quote, page 212. 2 further quotations will complete the material required for understanding James's account of truth. Quote, the true, to put it very briefly, is only the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving. Expedient in almost any fashion, and expedient in the long run, and on the whole of course. End of quote, page 222. Quote, our account of truth is an account of truths in the plural, of processes of leading, realized in rebus, and having only this quality in common, that they pay. End of quote, page 218. Before proceeding further, it will be as well to clear up a misunderstanding, from which the pragmatists themselves appear not to be exempt. When it is said that truth is one species of good, it is natural to suppose that ethical considerations are involved, and that logic will become dependent upon ethics. This view is, in fact, adopted in Dr. Schiller's essay, footnote 1, the first essay in his Humanism, end of footnote 1, on the ethical basis of metaphysics. But a closer examination shows that pragmatists mean by the word good whatever satisfies desire. Footnote 2. Schiller, Studies in Humanism, page 152. Quote, good and bad also, in their wider and primary sense, have reference to purpose. Good is what conduces to, bad what thwarts, a purpose. End of quote. End of footnote 2. So far as we know, they have nowhere justified this use of the word. But that is not our present concern. What concerns us at present is to observe that, in virtue of this definition, only psychological considerations are relevant where, to judge from the language, ethical considerations might seem to be involved. In order to judge whether a belief is true, it is only necessary to discover whether it tends to the satisfaction of desire. Footnote 3. Schiller, Studies in Humanism, page 154. Quote, in all actual knowing, the question whether an assertion is true or false is decided uniformly and very simply. It is decided, that is, by its consequences, by its bearing on the interest which prompted to the assertion, by its relation to the purpose which put the question. To add to this, that the consequences must be good, is superfluous. For if and so far as an assertion satisfies or forwards the purpose of the inquiry to which it owes its being, it is so far true. If and so far as it thwarts or baffles it, it is unworkable, unserviceable, false. End of quote. End of footnote 3. The nature of the desire to be satisfied is only relevant insofar as it may involve conflict with other desires. Thus, psychology is paramount, not only over logic and the theory of knowledge, but also over ethics. In order to discover what is good, we have only to inquire how people are to get what they want, and true beliefs are those which help in this process. This is the pragmatist theory of truth, and its consequences, as might be supposed, are far-reaching. Before considering the metaphysic which Dr. Schiller has deduced from the pragmatist theory of truth, let us examine the grounds upon which that theory is based. Most philosophies are determined by their initial questions, and by the facts which habitually fill the imagination of the philosopher. The initial question of pragmatism is: what characteristics of beliefs do in fact lead men to regard some as true, others as false? To answer this question, so pragmatism assumes, will give us the meaning of truth and falsehood. The facts which fill the imaginations of pragmatists are psychical facts. Where others might think of the starry heavens, pragmatists think of the perception of the starry heavens. Where others might think of God, pragmatists think of the belief in God, and so on. In discussing the sciences, they never think, like scientific specialists, about the facts upon which scientific theories are based. They think about the theories themselves. Thus, their initial question and their habitual imaginative background are both psychological. In order to arrive at an external world, they have to prove that the belief in an external world has the marks which, according to them, distinguish a true belief. Hence, they infer that there is an external world, and a similar process is necessary as regards all other facts which transcend the ego. One of the approaches to pragmatism is through the consideration of induction and scientific method. The old inductive philosophy, as exemplified in Mill's logic, conceived the nature and scope of induction far too narrowly, and pragmatism deserves credit for having remedied this defect. Induction, though it cannot give complete certainty, underlies all the sciences, even pure mathematics. In any science, we have a collection of facts bound together, as far as possible, by general laws. The facts appear in the formal exposition as deductions from the laws. This at least holds for the most advanced sciences, such as mathematics and physics. But in reality, the laws are inductions from facts. We cannot say that this or that fact proves this or that law. The whole body of facts proves, or rather renders probable, the whole body of laws. It might be thought that, in an experimentum crucis, a single fact establishes a single law. But this is only the case so long as the other laws of the science are taken for granted. If other facts should lead us to doubt the other laws, the interpretation of our experimentum crucis might be wholly changed. Thus, the justification of a science is that it fits all the known facts, and that no alternative system of hypotheses is known, which fits the facts equally well. We may therefore say, truly, that scientific theories are adopted simply because they work, that is, because their consequences are satisfactory. Thus, it would appear as though a right analysis of scientific induction led us straight to the pragmatist test of truth. Certain objections to this conclusion, however, at once suggest themselves. In the first place, scientific induction assumes certain data, the facts with which our theories have to agree. That the heavenly bodies have the apparent positions in the sky which we perceive them to have is not proved by astronomy, but it is assumed as the datum upon which astronomy proceeds. It would seem, therefore, that there are truths of fact which are prior to the whole inductive procedure, and that these truths of fact must be true in some other sense than that the consequences of supposing them true are satisfactory. To this argument, pragmatists reply that what really is fact is neither true nor false, but prior to the whole antithesis of truth and falsehood. Quote, day follows day, and its contents are simply added. The new contents themselves are not true, but simply come and are. Truth is what we say about them, and when we say that they have come, truth is satisfied by the plain additive formula. End of quote. Footnote 1, James, Pragmatism, page 62. End of footnote 1. Pragmatists contend, therefore, that the mere recognition of facts is the simplest case of the application of their formula. If all truth were of this simple nature, pragmatist doctrine would be unnecessary, though there would be nothing to show that it was false. But the truths which do not consist in the mere recognition of facts cannot, according to pragmatism, be explained in this simple way. Hence we are forced to adopt a theory of truth not derived from the exclusive consideration of this simplest case. For the moment, let us allow this answer to pass. We shall return to the subject of facts in connection with Dr. Schiller's doctrine of the making of reality. A more serious objection to the argument from the procedure of the sciences is derived from the ambiguity of the conception of working. What science requires of a working hypothesis is that it shall work theoretically, that is, that all its verifiable consequences shall be true and none false. The law of gravitation enables us to calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies. So far as these motions can be observed, they are found to agree with our calculations. It is true that the heavenly bodies have such and such apparent positions at such and such times, and the law of gravitation agrees with this truth. This is what we mean when we say that the law works. We do not mean that it gives us emotional satisfaction, that it satisfies our aspirations, that it is a help in navigation, or that it facilitates a virtuous life. Any or all of these may be true, but they are irrelevant. If they were all false, we should still say that the law works, because it agrees with observed facts. Thus, the kind of working which science desiderates is a very different thing from the kind which pragmatism considers to be the essence of truth. To this, as to our previous objection, pragmatists reply that the truth concerned is a particular species of truth, and that scientific working is a particular species of their general conception of working. Our purpose, they say, in asking the question to which the law of gravitation is an answer, is to be able to calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies. The law of gravitation furthers this purpose, and is therefore true in the pragmatic sense. This answer shows that the procedure of science, so far, has not been shown to contradict pragmatism. But it does not show that the procedure of science positively supports pragmatism. Where, as in science, our purpose is to discover truth, an answer which furthers our purpose will be true. But from this truism, it cannot be inferred, as pragmatists pretend, that if we had some quite different purpose, an answer which furthered it would still have been true. Another objection to the argument from working hypotheses is that by men of science these are explicitly contrasted with established truths. An hypothesis, as experience shows, may explain all known relevant facts admirably, and yet may at any moment be rendered inadequate by new facts. For this reason, prudent men give only a very provisional assent to a working hypothesis. Thus, the cases from which pragmatism endeavors to discover the nature of truth are the very cases in which we have least assurance that truth is present at all. This is certainly a curious and not very hopeful mode of procedure. It may be said, however, that what leads us to feel doubtful about a working hypothesis is merely that it has not yet been shown to work over a sufficiently wide field. The more it works, the more we believe in it. But to this again, it may be rejoined that the more it works, the less probability is there that any other hypothesis would also work. To pursue this topic, however, would require a discussion of the laws of probability, for which this is not the place. From what has been said, it results that the utmost that pragmatism can derive from science is that the scientific conception of working is not incompatible with the pragmatist conception, since the scientific working may be regarded as a species of the pragmatic working. It is, however, a species whose differentia adds just those elements which other philosophies declare to be necessary to truth, while pragmatism declares them to be unnecessary. The essential novelty of pragmatism is that it admits, as a ground of belief, any kind of satisfaction to be derived from entertaining the belief, not merely the theoretic satisfaction which is sought by science. For this contention, no support whatever is to be found in science. Let us see whether any support is to be found elsewhere. End of first half.